do it. It's go time.
Welcome to Go Time, your source for wide-ranging discussions from all around the Go community. Big thanks to our partners at Fly.io, the home of changelog.com. Easily launch your app close to your users all around the world. Find out how at Fly.io. Okay, here we go.
Welcome to Go Time. I'm Ian, and today I'm joined by a number of my lovely co-hosts, John, Kris, and Johnny. How are y'all today?
Lovely. You said it.
Doing good.
I'm just going with the flow here.
It's like rainy / foggy outside, so that's a little calm. But aside from that, doing good.
Yeah, it's been a little bit gross here, definitely. All right. Today we're going to discuss jumping into a new to you and existing code base, how to familiarize yourself, how to assess the state of the code base, and what to do when it's less than ideal. And we'll just jump right in. So what do you all think is the most important piece when you're jumping into like a brand new to you code base?
Does it have tests? Because before I touch anything, I want to know that I'm not going to break something.
No, clearly the first thing you do is you go home and you rewrite the whole thing over a weekend and then present it to your coworkers and be like, I fixed it. No, don't do that.
How to make enemies and alienate teammates. Got it.
I mean, I feel like if that's your goal, you need to do what Johnny said and make sure there are tests. Because even if you're going to be that person, if you don't have tests, it's likely you break a lot of things.
I feel like the first thing that you should do with the new code base is read it. Like, I feel like that sounds obvious, but I feel like a lot of the time people don't like sit down and actually like study what is there. They just kind of want to like jump in. I think we encourage people to, is like, no, we want you to like have your first commit on day one. And it's like, first commit, you don't know how this thing works. You know anything about this thing. How about you just sit down, study, learn it. Not forever, but maybe a week or two, especially if you're new on the job.
I feel like I'm slightly different. Like the most successful code bases I've jumped into, I feel like instead of reading it myself, what has worked best is having somebody who's been on the code base for a while sitting down with me and walking me through like, here are the important things I think you need to know. And even better if they can like walk you through your first commit. Like if they really do want you to have a commit early, somebody can guide you through that process to be like, I'm going to be here to hold your hand for the first one to sort of help familiarize you with it. Granted, it requires you to have a team that has somebody that can do that. So sometimes that's not always an option. I've definitely done my share of consulting things where there's nobody who knows how that code works. So good luck.
Yeah, I guess it's like what level are you when you enter the code base? Because, if you're like higher level, if you're like staff plus, then there's probably a good chance that people don't actually know how it works or only know how small corners of it works. But yeah, I think if there is someone that can sit down and just give you some good, like, here's how this all works, here's how it all fits together. But you should also go back and make sure that what they've said is true. Because a lot of the times people will think they know how things work, and then things have changed since they've touched a certain part of it, so they don't actually know how it works.
Sometimes it's impractical to attempt to read an entire code base. I mean, I don't know about y'all, but I've been around some pretty massive code bases, and trying to sit down and read through it all, I mean, that's just not practical, right? So if you have sort of an area in which you're going to start working, an area of responsibility, that may be just as good of a place to start to say, okay, well, can I localize or can I try to understand just this module or just this one service out of, dozens or hundreds, or, like basically, because I think for me, like learning just for the sake of learning, just to grok and have an idea where things are, that has some value, but it has diminishing return. So I usually need something that I'm trying to do or need to accomplish that sort of guides my sleuthing, right? It guides my research and what am I looking for? And then definitely if you have somebody to sort of be your guide, usually in my experience, the first commit is something super trivial. You're just trying to get it done just to get a, sort of a feel for the end-to-end workflow, right? But anything like any piece of feature or bug fix or anything like that usually requires a bit more effort and time to sort of wrap your head around. And if you're going to be sitting down and doing that yourself and having somebody you can always, hit up on a Slack or whatever to say, hey, like, I don't understand this, right? And or having somebody just give you a high level walkthrough, that's all valuable. But, at the end of the day, having a particular task you're trying to accomplish, I find that helps guide the exploration process.
I guess it's also like, what is your purpose for being in the code base or for learning this code base? Because if it's just like, oh, you're going to be like working on tickets, and those tickets are like put together by somebody else, and they're well scoped to a certain area of the code base, and the code base is well maintained, then it's probably not a good reason for you to sit down and, at least at first, go through and learn the entire thing. But if like you're going to be perhaps working in a bunch of different places in the code base, or no one really knows how the code base works, then I think it is super valuable for at least someone to sit down and read through the whole thing. And it's usually good for a new person to do that, because once again, there's a lot of, knowledge atrophies over time when it comes to code bases, because things move. And if you don't see all of those changes happening, then you won't know that things have moved. But if you have it, like, I guess this is all contingent on like not having a well-documented code base, because if you have a really well-documented code base, then you can probably just like read the documentation and then get going. And if it's like well-structured, then you can really just compartmentalize and read the parts that are well sectioned off and kind of in the scope of what you want to do. But like, I have not run across any of these code bases in my career. Like I've attempted to create some that are well documented and have like, okay, here's all the docs, here's all the readmes, here's all the comments, here's the layout of the thing, here's a document that'll walk you through it. But I don't think I've ever entered a space, like entered a company or an organization where that like is the current state of the code base. And that's perhaps me and just like my weird career that I've had. But I think probably most code bases right now are in that state where they are not necessarily well documented, where most of the people in the organization don't know like how a lot of the stuff works, and they only know how like certain parts of it works. So I don't know. I guess it's just like, if you have people that know things, or if you have good documentation, that's a really good place to start. But I don't know if it's necessarily practical to go into a lot of new code bases with the idea that there's going to be somebody else that can help you necessarily.
Never assume the documentation is good, right? I mean, because you don't know if it's good or not, right? I mean, there could be a ton of it. There could be diagrams, but how
it could be old.
Up to date has that been? Yeah,
Johnny's thinking last commit was last week, and the last documentation update was 3 years ago. It's like,
come on. I mean, you said it yourself, right, Kris? And that you never counted a code base. I've been doing this for like 25 years. Neither have I, right? Like, so I it's safe to say that whatever documentation you find is an attempt at providing some sort of guidance. But like, the moment I get into a code base, I do the Boy Scout rule, leave it better than you found it kind of thing, right? I start finding things like immediately, right? I start saying, oh, well, this class no longer exists. Oh, well, this function no longer exists. Plus, there's something to say about sort of walking through a sort of a statically typed, strongly typed language, like in a code base, over a dynamic interpreted thing. Right? I can use my editor, or even without an editor, right? I should be able to use, for something like Go, I should be able to sort of do a Go def, right? Go find where this particular struct has defined, or this particular interface is defined. Go learn more, like by following, right, what the compiler is going to be doing to identify these things. Do these things make sense? Do they exist? Is this in the case of Go, this variable can be declared and not used, right? But not every language gives you that sort of capability, right? Especially interpreted stuff. Like, I remember going through Ruby code bases where I was just pulling my hair trying to figure out what something did, because some of the things that made the language great and friendly, like the method missing, right, all that like magical stuff, also made the code base hard to wrap my head around, right? And I have a very different experience when I'm using something like Go or Java or something like that, where I can rely on the static nature of the language, right? So those experiences are very different in my opinion.
yeah, like I'm thinking about the Ruby cases, and I've seen JavaScript code bases that were worse in my experience. But like, when people have like the on save like callbacks for like models in your database, if they have too many of them, sometimes it can be very confusing to try to trace how things are happening, because you'll do what you said, Johnny. Like, you want to add a feature for like, maybe it's to edit a to-do item, on like a simple to-do app, and you go through and you follow, and you're like, all this thing does is saves this thing. How are all these other functions being called? And it does, you have to like dig into everything to sort of figure out like, oh, there's all these callbacks that occur, and like now all of a sudden tracing it is a lot harder. Whereas like in a language like Go, I don't feel like that tends to happen as often. It's a lot more explicit, like, I'm going to do these things now. Well, sometimes I should say.
I feel like it depends on who's written it. Like if you have a code base that was written by somebody that is either like from a dynamic language or is super interface happy, I found that that has that same problem of like, oh, where is this thing defined? It's like, oh, it's an interface. Where is the implementation for this interface? Like, where is this thing located? And it's like, oh, it's like in this other package way over there. And I think now, like Go Guru and Go Please can help you traverse through some of that by being like, oh, what implements it? And here's the context that I'm looking at it in. But it can be like super tough to traverse that sort of stuff when like the code base hasn't been structured with the idea that you should be able to use these static analysis tools to find your way around.
Yeah. I think that's something to definitely consider, even when just writing code, is that there's always trade-offs for everything. But like when you use an interface, a lot of times people are like, well, why don't use it or why don't you use interface? Because then you could plug in anything here. But like you said, there are cases where it's harder to figure out like what's actually being called here. And if you don't need the interface, it might have been better to just use that thing.
Yeah. I mean, if you properly use Go and properly used interfaces in Go, then you wind up with like interfaces kind of being the last point you need to look at something where it's just like, okay, well, it doesn't really matter what's behind this. I don't particularly care. Like it's like, oh, it's an IO writer. I don't really care what's behind that. I just know it's going to write something unless there's like some specific bug or some specific functionality I'm looking for. But unfortunately, a lot of interfaces in Go are not written like that. At least in my experience, a lot of interfaces in Go aren't designed like that. They're designed in that Java-esque style where it's like, oh, we have an interface here. And then there's an implementation probably called impl laying around somewhere. Where? I don't know, but it's somewhere in here.
This is a changelog news break. Pewter is the Internet OS. Pewter is an advanced open source desktop environment in the browser designed to be feature-rich, exceptionally fast, and highly extensible. It can be used to build remote desktop environments or serve as an interface for cloud storage services, remote servers, web hosting platforms, and more. I've been around long enough to see a bunch of these desktop OS in a browser window demos and toys, but this is the first time I've been impressed by one enough to keep the tab open longer than 30 seconds. From the URL structure to the cloud storage integration to the developer portal, Pewter strikes me as an actually viable internet-based operating system with potentially real-world use cases. And that's saying a lot. Oh, and it's also entirely built with vanilla JavaScript and jQuery. So you know the devs haven't cargo culted together something they can't grow and maintain. On that note, they say, for performance reasons, Pewter is built with vanilla JavaScript and jQuery. Additionally, we'd like to avoid complex abstractions and to remain in control of the entire stack as much as possible. Also, partly inspired by some of our favorite projects that are not built with frameworks: VS Code, Photopea, and OnlyOffice. You just heard one of our 5 top stories from Monday's Changelog News. Subscribe to the podcast to get all of the week's top stories and pop your email address in at changelog.com/news to also receive our free companion email with even more developer news worth your attention. Once again, that's changelog.com/news.
So, have any of you guys done consulting?
Yep.
A little bit, yeah.
Okay. Have you found the way you approach a code base is different then? Like I'm saying from my experience, maybe this will help. In my experience, one of the hardest shifts as a consultant was that you went from that like, okay, I'm here to learn the code base long term. And a lot of times for some of the consulting gigs, it's like my job right now is to get this task done as quickly as possible. And I need to, like, I might see things or want to understand things more, but if it's not pertinent to what I'm doing, I have to like force myself to not go down those rabbit holes and not try to refactor this thing. Because it's like, that's not really what they want me here for right now.
Yeah. Similar approach. I'll make notes of things. I'll be like, hey, it might be useful to, look at this later on. On my discovery process, I found X, Y, and Z, but I'm going to solve this one problem. But these are things you may want to look at. But I have to be very disciplined not to touch those other things because I could open a can of worms that I really, don't want to get into or that they're not paying me to get into.
I've not done the consulting, but I still think that's like even inside a company, it's a valuable skill to be like, I'm going to note this for later, but that's not my job right now. I need to finish this task.
Yeah. Like when you're trying to do task specific work, it's good not to go on those like wild like goose chases. But of course, if you are a full-time person, like the thing I've seen with a lot of internal people is that they think of themselves as like like contracting or consultants, where it's just like, no, we just gotta fix this like little one thing, and then you wind up in a situation where there's like this big haunted garden that's at like the core of what the software is supposed to be doing, and everybody's like, yeah, none of us really know how that works. So just be very careful when you touch things in there, and hopefully you won't break anything.
Yeah, at my current job, there's code comments that say "Here be dragons" all over, and it's like, don't touch these blocks.
It doesn't tell you why. It doesn't tell you why, but it just says don't touch.
Yep.
Great. That's awesome.
So obviously that's a red flag. How else do you, like, as you're doing this exploration, how do you assess like the health of this code base? Like, what tells you it's good? What tells you it's maybe lacking in some areas?
How quickly can I get in and out and get the task accomplished?
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, how quickly can I actually like understand a concept, like the concepts in the code base that I need to understand? Like, how cleanly separated are they? How like well documented are they? Like, how good are the variable names and method names and type names?
Yeah, I think a lot of that does come to like what Johnny had said earlier about picking a specific task, at least for me, of like trying to trace, like whether it's a web request or something, just trying to trace it and see how the whole thing flows. And if that's pretty easy to get through and like to intuitively be like, oh, I bet it's going to this file or this package next, then it helps. But if you feel like at any point in time there could be like a random twist or turn that you weren't expecting, I'm like, oh, this is not where I'd like this to be.
It's almost like also how deep do you have to go? Like the more times I have to command click and follow something.
I think he's like jump to definition.
Oh.
All right. Yeah, he likes to use the mouse. Forgive him. Forgive him.
Use
it's
my
okay.
mouse.
I always feel bad about saying shortcuts because I don't know which ones I've changed at this point. So like if I say it and then everybody's like, what shortcut is that? I'm like, oh yeah, that's not the normal one.
Do you all really not use your mouse? This is a side, but
No, like if I need to go to a definition, it's control right bracket or right square bracket in NeoVim, and that just pops me where I want to go, and then I can use Control T to get back out, I do not use my mouse in NeoVim. It's just I just move around.
I'll say this: I use my mouse for some things, but not for go to definition.
Definitely not for go to definition because I'm doing it so often. I've had to remap my keyboard. I just have right now. I use like Vim mode and VS Code, and I just have a GD as my shortcut, and I'm constantly hitting those keys.
All right, maybe I need to reassess this. But back to our normal discussion. Assessing the health. Something I look at is, one, like, do tests exist? And two, like, what are the tests actually testing? I know if they're like testing exact outputs and stuff, maintaining this is going to be annoying because I'm going to have to fix 30 tests when I change one thing, right? I don't know where else I was going with that. Any opinions there?
Are you talking about the quality of the tests?
Yeah, like the quality of the test. Like, I'll see someone testing an HTTP handler and they're testing the exact JSON output versus the inputs, right? And so you omit empty one field and all of a sudden you have to fix 30 different tests and you have to go through that string JSON to find it, right? Stuff like that.
It's hard to, like, I used to have this very sort of judgmental approach to like reviewing code and stuff, and especially a code base I didn't know. Like I've since like ratcheted that way down. Like I'll go in and sort of with a not sympathy, empathy, right? For not knowing what I don't know, not knowing why a particular test was written the way it was, or something like that. Who knows? Maybe it might have been written by a junior who didn't really know at what level to test. Maybe it was written by a senior developer who just wanted to get something out the door because deadlines. Maybe it was written by somebody who's new to Go, period, right? They might be experienced, but maybe they're found something on Stack Overflow or some blog post where the recommendation perhaps not the most idiomatic or the best thing to do. Like there's a variety of reasons why things like tests or even implementation details, right, may vary. Usually what I like to do is to sort of maybe highlight a particular piece of code and basically ask people. Like a lot of times too, one of the things I like to do is basically record a quick video, right, of a particular a set of things that I'm looking at. I'm like, hey, I noticed that this, but when I go here, I see this. Or when I go to this test, if I change this one thing, 5 of these other things break. Before I attempt to fix anything, can anybody provide some insight or input into why it was done this way? Because I don't want to assume that I'm just going to make the world better when I could just make it worse, right? And then I'll put that out there, and then stream of comments will come back and, oh, yeah, I remember this. Like so-and-so did this because we had to do X, Y, and Z reason, right? Like, and you learn so much about sort of the history, because like, definitely not during interviews or consultant, discovery. You are going to learn things while, like, when you come across something that basically, you try a problem you're trying to solve. And at that time, you're going to get some context in history for some of those decisions, if those people are still around, right? If nobody's around and you want to chance it, again, if it has to do with the task you're trying to solve, yeah, do the job they hired you to do. But before I change anything, I usually like to ask, this is what I like to do, but when I do this happens. Like, do I need to change my approach, or was this sort of, boinked, and I might as well fix it while I'm touching this code kind of thing.
So as a follow-up question for any of you, I guess, are there certain types of tests that you will look at and be like, this absolutely needs to get changed? Like, does that make sense? The example that comes to my mind, at least, is whenever you have a code base that has tests that sometimes pass and sometimes fail.
Oh,
I'm very very strongly opinionated of this test either needs to get removed or needs to be fixed, because as it stands right now, it's not benefiting anybody.
Yeah, I feel like when the tests are also like very verbose, and it's just like you haven't used like table testing or any of those techniques, like that's another sign of just like, well, you should probably do some cleanup around this so we can actually make these tests tractable in some way. But yeah, definitely if there's flaky tests, those are just, because then it's just a bunch of noise, and you're just like, the build's failing, and then you get used to just seeing the build fail randomly. And you're like, oh, it's just failed. But then it's like, oh no, an actual real test, like a test that's not flaky, is failing now. You didn't see it for like 5 minutes. You thought it was a flaky test. It's like, yeah, just figure out how to make those flaky tests not flaky. Of course, sometimes like the underlying problem of why a test is flaky is like deeply entrenched in the code base because of some weird timing thing that like. It's like, just increase the timer by 5 more seconds and then it'll stop being flaky. And you're like, okay, but we should also fix the thing in the code base that's making it like that.
Any test that talks to external systems, the moment I see that in a unit test, that's a code smell for me. Like even so, there's a gray zone there, especially if you're interacting, say, with the database. Maybe you have a local version of that database running and you want to basically, as you're writing your tests, you don't want to stub out database calls or something like that or whatever. But even for those, there are sort of mocking libraries for, SQL server-based database servers and things of that nature. They take a bit of effort to set up, but they may, in some cases, I'm not going to say always, but in some cases, they may be worth sort of investing in, especially if you have a lot of tests, and especially if you're going to be running a lot of tests in CI. The fewer dependencies you have on external services during your tests, the faster your tests run. But if you have to sort of make that separation between unit tests and integration tests. If I see a code base where the lines are blurred for no good reason, then I'm usually like, we need to do something about this. I'm not going to fix it all now over the weekend or whatever, but I'm going to raise this as a flag. Like, this is something that we should really spend some time addressing.
I feel like testing is one of those areas where we even as an industry have just like not really figured out how to do this well yet. Like even with mocking, it's like I've tried to use SQL mocks so many times, and they always like you just wind up with such a rat's nest of this mocked code, because it's like there's a really fine line between like where it's useful and where it's just like, well, now you're just implementing a database in SQL mock, and it's just absolutely atrocious. And you make like one small schema change, and there's just like cascading problems with everything. But I feel like there's that same line between like what is a unit test and what is an integration test, and like, is it like a speed thing or is it like an encapsulation thing? What happens when there's things that are kind of on the edge there? And then you're talking about like, okay, well, that if you want to do unit tests well, you need to structure your code base in a certain way. And is it actually practical to structure it in that way? Is it worth it? I feel like there's a lot of like open questions there that I don't know, feel like they don't really get asked or answered a lot because it's just like, oh, just you should be using a unit test here. I'm like, well, what do you mean by a unit test? How do you define a unit test? But I think that's more of a philosophical meta thing.
It doesn't have to be, right? I mean, I think a lot of times in my experience, it's team dependent, right? Like personally on my teams, right? So concrete example, rather than passing an instance of SQL DB or something that implements it, right? Like, like GORM or SQL X, whatever, right? Whatever you want to use. Rather than passing a value of that particular type, I'll use a data access pattern instead, right? I'll say, okay, here's a thing, right, that is able to provide you the data you're looking for. Whether that thing uses, like an in-memory data store, or whether it actually uses a network connection to make a database request, it doesn't matter to you. The thing that needs to say, hey, DAO, can I get, a list of users or whatever, right? That way, you're not forced to then, for every single thing that might need data, right? You're not forced to then, say, well, I need to know how to handle a database connection when I initialize this particular struct or whatever, right? Like, you just passing on DAO, right? That way, that DAO, you can just have a test for that. If you want to, have one where you're dealing with database connections, that test is localized to just that thing, right? And then no other thing that uses it, right? No other service or struct, whatever it is, right, needs to know how you get this particular kind of data. You just simply have a DAO that gives you that data, right? So that's a decision that I had to make that, hey, on our team, this is how we're going to do this. But I've seen it done differently on other teams, right? And as long as you're consistent, I'd rather the consistency, right, than a hodgepodge different mixtures of style and approaches on the same project.
Yeah, DAO stands for data access object, right?
Yes.
I put in the show notes to add a link to something for that. Just, I think all of us knew what he was saying, but at the same time, it's like somebody listening might not know for sure. So it's like, have a link there.
Well, thank you. I forget sometimes that not everybody's in my head.
I think I became more aware of this whenever I worked in the government sector, because I feel like somebody's job there is to make acronyms. So like you get software and then you get acronyms on top of that built in, that it's like, if you haven't worked here for 6 months, you have no idea what's going on anywhere. Because even the comments in the code are like all acronyms, and you're like, this makes no sense.
This is also a very corporate thing. Like almost every large corporate environment I've been in is just like, here's the soup of acronyms, and some of them are the same acronyms, but they mean different things. So you need to know by context which acronym you're actually supposed to, like. You just got to figure it out. And you're like, and then new ones pop up all the time, and you're like, what does that mean?
So I do want to get into like how to handle when you do discover these kind of nasty things. But first, any other like major code smells when you first jump into a data, like a code base, anything like that?
Lack of comments, or hostile lack of comments. Because, in Go, the linter tools will yell at you if you don't comment your publicly exported things. And a trick I've seen in numerous code bases is people that just put like the name of the thing and then ... to get the linter to shut up.
That is every function in the code base I work in.
That's
and
awesome.
I'm like, this is a malicious compliance thing, and it is just so smelly.
I'm shocked they don't just turn off that like warnings and stuff. Because like when I've recorded courses, because I'm verbally explaining what's going on, I'm like, I'm not going to make you watch me write this comment. So I'll turn those warnings off just for recording stuff, because I'm like, I don't want to do this. But I've never seen people be that malicious where they're like, I'm going to do exactly what it wants and nothing more.
I have seen it many a times, and it is... Ugh.
I will admit, if I'm writing a library to be used by others, I will use GoDoc like judiciously. But if I'm in sort of a line of business application where the names are self-explanatory enough, and I don't have a particular behavior that does something sort of sophisticated, right, where it warrants that extra piece of documentation, right, then I'll sometimes... most of the time, I say 50% of the time, I omit the GoDoc, right? I'm much more stringent with it for libraries than I am with sort of regular application logic, if it has good names.
I was going to say an example of this, the like classic when you're learning Go, is if you have like a greet function that takes in a name and returns a string that greets that person. I don't feel like the documentation for that's going to be super useful. Like at that point, it's like, I'm pretty sure I can guess what this is doing.
Yeah. Although there's a part of me that's just like, if you can't write documentation for it, should it be exported at all? Or should it be something? It should just be a private thing. Like, I don't know. Maybe it's a little too stringent, but I feel like if you don't know the purpose of this thing, you can't say it's a purpose. Should it exist?
I simply assume like we all did this already. Like, well, perhaps I shouldn't assume, right? Like, if you obviously we're talking about Go here. So if you capitalize something, and again, if you're writing a library, there better be some comments on that thing, because if that's stuff, especially if it's published, that stuff shows up in pkg.go.dev. I want to know what the heck I'm looking at, right? If it's internal code base and you export it, if it's a library, again, still better have some Go doc on it. If it's regular application logic and you export it, the question then during code review, right? I'm gonna be asking, hey, this doesn't seem to be used anywhere else outside of this package. Do we need to export that? And I usually get, oh yeah, you're right. Like basically for some reason, out of habit or whatever it is, right? Or maybe they're writing a particular, creating a particular struct, and just maybe the name of it just kind of lends well to having capitalization. I've seen, struck with methods, all of them being capitalized. And I'm like, does this one need to be capitalized? I was just on a train of thought, and I just happen to capitalize everything completely accidentally, right? And if somebody doesn't say, hey, do you need this to be, visible outside the package, right? Then it'll just happen to go in there, like, without any good reason.
Yeah.
I feel like for whatever reason, exported functions and everything look more aesthetically pleasing. Even though like I know I have to not do it, it looks better.
100%.
Exactly. It just looks better, visually more appealing.
And I think that's why it happens a lot, is it's just like, this just looks better.
Right.
You feel important. You're exporting something. You're giving something out to somebody.
I wouldn't be shocked if there's people who are learning Go who don't realize that there's a difference between the two. They're just like, oh, this person got lazy and didn't capitalize this one.
I mean, I do feel like if you don't make it lowercase, you don't like make it not exported by default, that does lead to a bit of packagitis, which will then lead to people liberally using the internal directory, which always irks me a bit. I'm like, can you just make it one package? Like, I don't know, what are you doing? Like, why do you have all these packages? You have this weird like import graph now. Just don't do it. Just make it all internal. It'll be fine. But I think that's like part of the reason why people start exporting things. They're like, oh, but I need to use this from this other package. It's like, well, should that other package actually exist? Or can you just have these two things be in the same package?
Mm-hmm. So I'm assuming your question, Ian, extends to not just the code base, but the operational side of things. And to it, I'm thinking about when this code is actually running. I'm a big fan of, as they say, testing in production, right? When this thing is actually running, what sort of visibility do we have into what it's doing? Is there any observability? These days, most people, are or should be doing some sort of open telemetry, tracing or metrics or both. So what kind of observability do I have into this thing, right? When it runs, right? Especially at scale, right? Like, do we have any of that? And if we don't, depending on the criticality of that piece of software for the business, I'm going to be a very big proponent of, can we get something in here quickly?
And on the other side of it too, is like, is there too much, right? Have you just added like metrics and log lines for literally everything? So now it's just a lot of noise, because I've seen that as well.
That's like the flaky test problem again. It's just, if you have too much of something, or if it's not useful, it's like, why is this here?
I mean, it's like the Grafana dashboard problem. It's not just Grafana specifically, but the dashboard problem, where it's just like, look, we have all these dashboards. I'm like, okay, and what do they mean? Like, what are they saying? What are they telling you? Like, I don't know, when the number changes, that means something's bad. It's like, that's not good enough. Like,
so I had this happen where I had Google Analytics on a personal site, and then I took it off, and somebody like gave me, like, they're like, why would you take that away? And I was like, basically, what I found was that I wasn't acting on any of the analytics I was seeing. It was literally just numbers to look at on graphs. And I came to the conclusion that there's no real reason for this to be here unless I'm going to act on it or do something with it. So I feel like observability is kind of similar, where if you can't see a situation where you're going to act on it, it's like, why is this here aside from just, it may be seeing the graph is useful for certain people. Like, you have a higher up who wants to see some particular graph or something, and that makes sense. But I feel like at times people add a lot of data thinking, oh, more data is fine. But if there's not like a clear use for it, it's like, why is this here?
Yeah, I guess that's another code smell of like, if you haven't designed the debugging aspects of your software, you're just going to have a lot of pain in the future. If a code base you walk into doesn't have like an actual like thought put into how debugging will happen, how you observe it, then that's definitely something that should probably get fixed.
I have a counterpoint to that though. Sometimes I don't know what's important yet, right?
So I can agree with that. I suppose what I would say is when you add metrics to and you don't know what's important, are you at least envisioning scenarios where like this could be useful if we needed to do these things? Versus I've seen cases where people just log everything, and if you ask them like, what are some scenarios where this might be useful, and they can't tell you anything, they're like, oh, I just put that there just in case. And I feel like you get that a lot at times where it feels like they haven't thought out the actual like the problems that could arise, and instead they've just shotgun spray at the wall hoping something works.
That reminds me of something I see a lot is someone will log an error and then handle the error or pass it up. And then the next function sees the error, logs it again, and then passes it up, and then logs it again, and then passes it up. But anyways, so I do want to transition a little bit to like what we can do when you found yourself in a situation where things aren't ideal.
I have a very meta answer.
Yeah, go for it.
I would say, as I've harped on a lot of times before, get your organization to hire knowledge management people. Like, I feel like this is something that like doesn't get said enough in our industry, but we have like a crap load of information we're trying to manage. Kind of, Johnny, as you mentioned before, like there's a lot of knowledge in people's heads, and it's like, oh, well, how does this thing work, or how did we get to this place, or why is this thing written this way? And that's in people's heads, and if they leave, then it's no longer there. Now you have no idea. So like advocating to hire, it could just be like one person that does that, archiving, librarian, historian type of task to actually document and write out like here's the decisions, and then organize that information could be like a huge benefit in the future to actually being able to understand and make code bases better. So like that's kind of like a macro level thing.
Shouldn't that be everybody's job though?
No,
because I doubt you're gonna get any company to hire one individual to do that job specifically and nothing else.
It's not necessary. Well, it's something where it's just like, I don't know. That's kind of like asking, shouldn't everybody just write their own crypto? Like, no, it's just like, this is a very specialized skill set that people get PhDs in, and it's very difficult work. And you should hire somebody that's trained in how to do that thing, especially if it's an important thing to your organization, which if you're going to be writing thousands to tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of lines of code, and you need to manage that asset you have, you should probably ensure that you have a lot of knowledge about what went into creating it and the history of that.
I think this is like, it's one of the reasons that I've, for whatever reason, don't care for Slack that much, is that I feel like there's a lot of, like somebody will ask a question and then somebody who's very knowledgeable will share that information, and then it just kind of sits in Slack. And I feel like Slack is not the ideal like format to find that information later when you're looking for it. So the only way to like get that information again later, at least in my limited experience, has been to like somebody else ask the same question, and then somebody else who either knew about the conversation can link to it, or if they didn't know about the conversation, that same person might have to reiterate, oh, here's the information. And I don't know like the correct solution, but it definitely...
I'll tell you what the correct solution is. It is to buy the enterprise version of Slack with the AI plugin in there, where it's gonna harness all that data, and you can talk to the AI to say, hey, did somebody already ask this question?
I mean, that would be great. Honestly, that would be awesome.
So the AI lies to you. It's just like, this is the reason why this happened. You're like, that's not what the data says.
But I mean, there have been times where, I don't know if this is what you were referring to, Chris, but having either somebody or there's some tools to make it easier to take like when those things pop up to then populate a knowledge base of some sort and like to properly organize and index things. Like, because I think Slack is great for starting those conversations and opening up questions like nobody really knows how this works or this needs explained better. It's just when it doesn't make its way back to the code or back to someplace that's more easily discoverable, then it's frustrating because it's like we have this great bit of information here that's just not being put where it should be for long term.
And that's like what the job of an archivist is, right? They're supposed to go around and extract knowledge out of places and put it in a place where you can then go find it and use it in the future, which is kind of like exactly what you want when you have, especially complicated code bases, or you want to make it so people can actually go into a new code base and understand the thing. Right. Like, once again, like we write documentation for a reason. We want documentation so you can actually get into and understand things quickly. You can get up and running quickly. Because, like, I don't know, there's a lot of code bases that I've walked into where it's just like there's 10, 20 engineers trying to work on the thing. Nobody has any idea how anything works. And the number of bugs per feature introduced is like a multiple. So it's like, oh, you make a feature and then you break 4 or 5 things. And the reason you broke those things is because you didn't know about this other stuff that you need to know about, because that knowledge is scattered among like 6 or 7 people's heads. And so now you're like, just now you have to go and fix all those bugs, which is using more engineering time, which means that like we could have just hired, one of these people that they don't cost that much money in like startup or organizational sense. And then you wouldn't have burned all of that time of the engineers trying to figure out how this thing works. Or you might be able to hire an engineer and have them be productive in, say, a week instead of 4 months across like the entire code base. So it's like one of those things where it's like, this could clearly work for getting us to have better code bases, but it's a not technical solution. So I don't think anybody's really going to do it.
So I'm the CTO for a startup, a small engineering team, and I cannot see myself hiring somebody just for that job. Not that I'm disagreeing with you. Ideally, yes, we would have somebody do that job. But right now, because we don't have such a specific role, or probably won't for quite a while, the way I choose to run my team is to make sure that anytime I have to explain something in a stand-up longer than 2 minutes, or anytime I have to explain during a pairing session, oh, this is why we did this or this or this, I'm like, oh, this is time for a decision record or some sort of, we keep our documentation in Confluence. Yes, I know. It's fine. It works. But we keep our documentation in Confluence, and we keep decision records in Confluence. We link to things in Jira. Again, yes, I know, but it works well enough. And we can cross-reference things, right? Basically, we use these tools to help give us, right, that archive, right? Basically, if somebody doesn't know why, anytime somebody asks a question, why do we do things this way? If I can't point, right, to where that answer is, if the answer has to come out of my head, that's immediately a flag that, okay, this needs to be written down somewhere. That's either documentation or decision record, or maybe the README for something somewhere. But if the only way they could get an answer for that question was to ask me, there's a problem.
Yeah. And I think this is like part of the issue that we have as an industry, is that we're not very good at understanding the costs of like how much does it actually cost when this knowledge isn't properly managed? What in actual dollar terms is it? And if we could quantify that, I think most startups would hire like a librarian/archivist as their like 3rd or 4th hire after a couple of engineers, because it only takes like a couple of engineers to start generating a large enough amount of knowledge where if you're forcing them to do all of that work of knowledge archiving, you're going to slow them down a lot, and they're probably not going to be that good at it, unless of course maybe like they were a librarian in a past life, or they studied it because they like it. But I think like in the long, like once you start getting to a certain size of an organization, like it just becomes like the wikis become like these graveyards of like, okay, I found some information. Is this information correct? And how do I actually assess that?
Have you worked at very small startups, Kris?
I've worked at very small companies, not very small startups specifically.
Okay. Like, I guess I'm saying, in my experience, I would agree with Johnny that I don't see this happening on like the smaller side. Like maybe past 10 employees, possibly. Like below that, I wouldn't see it happening, because in my mind, one, when you're that small, I feel like it's a very tight-knit group for the most part, just because you're working so closely together all the time. And a lot of times you're like desperately trying to prove that what you're building can actually make money. So spending time on anything else is, as much as it sucks to have that debt, it's just hard to justify spending any money on anything else, because you're always at risk of just dying.
Mm-hmm.
So it becomes very, very hard at that point. So like there definitely comes a point where like, okay, we've proven that this is a viable market, and we're moving into like, we're going to start scaling and doing things like that. And I think around then is when you could be like, okay, now we strongly need to consider, how do we consolidate knowledge, make sure new hires are going to be productive, and those things. But until you hit that point, it's very hard to spend any effort on anything else.
I mean, it's kind of a bit like I would equate it to like, I mean, maybe this is like a good model for it too, like accounting and bookkeeping. I mean, I feel like the argument is like actually equivalent to that of it's like, yeah, no, it'd be great if you just didn't have to care about bookkeeping because you're a small company. You just need to go. It'd be much easier. Just spend money. It'll be okay. And then we'll figure out how to actually do bookkeeping and accounting later when we're big enough to actually get in an accountant or bookkeeper and have them do this work. And it's like, yeah, but by the time you get there, you're going to have such a nightmare that it's going to be really hard to dig yourself out of it. And I think knowledge management is even a worse thing. Like the reason I say like do it when you're a small organization is because there practically isn't a point along the continuum until you're huge and the problem is intractable, that you can actually stop and say, okay, yes, we will hire someone. Because even once you are like 10 to 20 to 30 or 50, 40 or 50 people, you'll say the same thing of like, well, we're just trying to move fast. We gotta keep going. We don't have time to stop. And there's already this mountain of stuff. It's fine. We'll be able to do it well. And the point just never comes. And so like, if you want to actually, and of course, like there's plenty of like large companies that manage to get along without having these people in small startups and lots of organizations. So obviously we've been able to work as an industry along this path of being able to get out there. But I think that we've underestimated how empowering someone with this type of skill set can be to the organization. Right? I think it's a lot like esports teams, and how in the past it was just kind of like, oh, we just like have a group of 5 probably dudes or some number of dudes, and they're just playing. And then we added a coach, and then everybody started to get better. And then they added sports psychologist, and then they started to get really like tremendously better at these things. And it's like, you know, if you went to a esports team and you're like, yeah, you should hire a sports psychologist, they'd be like, why would we do that? And it's like, well, because like your earnings are going to go up by so much because you have this person that's going to be able to empower everybody. And I think like this type of knowledge management role is the same thing there. And I think our code bases and the state of them and how they are pretty bad. I mean, Johnny, you and I both said that in our, you know, combined like nearly 50 years of doing this, like we haven't come across a code base that's just like good when we get to it, right? That has like things set up well where it's like you can actually do things where you don't have to go and fish some information out of somebody's head. So it's clear that like there's a problem here that needs to get fixed in some way. I'm just advocating that this role is it. There's probably other ways to do it as well. I don't think AI is the way. I really don't think AI is going to help us here. But I think like if we wanted to like macro level solve the problem in the big, it would be having this. But I also recognize that, as you said, Johnny, like this is impractical for a number of reasons for most people. It would take a startup that wants to be, or a company that wants to be innovative in that small space. And quite frankly, most companies just don't want to innovate in that space. They don't want to make changes. They want to just pick up the playbook and just go forward with it. And that's fine. Just recognize that your code base is probably not going to be great when you start scaling. And it probably might not ever be like a nice, good code base unless you happen to stumble upon and hire somebody that does engineering that also has like these skill sets to manage knowledge well, or you have a CTO or an SVP or whoever who pushes, kind of like you are, Johnny, really hard to make sure that knowledge is well managed and it's not just getting stuck in people's heads.
Sounds like we could have a whole episode on why our code bases aren't good.
You asked how we could make our code bases better. I was just giving you the ultimate not utopia, but the ultimate really good way to just fix the problem if we want to fix the problem.
All right. Could we get... So we're running a little bit short on time. I do want to get some more concrete, less meta happening as we normally do. So I might just kind of speed round some questions for y'all. So as you're jumping into a new code base, and you know there might be some patterns that aren't good, how do you juggle between consistency and making improvements? You can't go over the weekend and just change it everywhere, right? So what are the trade-offs there, and how do you manage that?
Consistency over new patterns, unless there's a demonstrable like 10x return on that investment. Even if it's not if we're using a library to access data, maybe it's not the best one, but if I'm going to introduce a new way to do things, I need to, one, have a proof of concept that shows, hey, if we do this, we're going to get a 10x return on that investment. And we're going to need to apply this across the board. That way, there's no 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 different ways of doing the same thing. There's just one, right? If I can't get the time and resources and the room, right, within the engineering budget, right, time-wise, right, to make this happen, then I will consistently keep doing it with the old way until such a time an opportunity presents itself for me to change it across the board. So I pick consistency every time.
I think I agree with Johnny mostly there. So I'm curious what Kris has to say.
I like consistency, but with small changes over time. Because I feel like being too stringent on consistency leads you into that foolish consistency realm where you're doing consistency just because we've always done it this way sort of consistency, which I think is very problematic in a lot of code bases. So I think you need to have like, I think actually the opposite of what you said, Johnny. I think you need to have small changes to how you do things and how that consistency works over time, and those kind of grow into the larger changes across things. So I think when you're trying to introduce a large change, that's when you're going to get the most amount of pushback on things. That's when you're going to have to show, here's the giant amount of like betterness that you get from this thing, which I think is often difficult to prove to like other engineers, especially people who are invested in the way things are now. But often if you can find small ways to shift that consistency, and you instill that, hey, we're going to be able to make small changes to consistency as long as the overall consistency of the code base remains the same, I think that's good, right? You want to avoid the lava layers, but you also don't want to just keep everything the same for the sake of keeping everything the same. And I feel like in the past, small adjustments to things have worked well for me.
Nuance to my statement. In most cases, it may be very impractical to say, well, there's a new way that is demonstrably 10x better than the previous way. We need to go away for 6 months so that we can apply it all and then bring in one full swap, right? Definitely, we're going to be incrementally changing it, right? What we're not going to do is somebody not knowing that, hey, we are on this journey to transition from this way of doing things to this way of doing things, right? And we're incrementally, every time somebody touches an area of the code base where the old pattern is used, this is your opportunity not only to get the job done that you're actually trying to do, but to also transition the old way to the new way, right? Then that happens incrementally, right? Absolutely, that's the way it should be done. There's no, sort of a go away for, an amount of time and then come back with a brand new thing. First of all, you're asking for trouble. Something will break, if you do that.
Your PR will never merge.
Yeah, don't do that. Don't do that, right?
I think I agree with Johnny with that. Like, you need to have buy-in from everybody. And if everybody isn't on board with it, it just isn't going to work, because somebody's going to continue writing the old way and it's just going to be really bad. And I've seen code bases where like they keep changing. Like they're like, we're going to use this pattern. And then a little bit later, we're going to use this pattern. And then before long, there's like 6 patterns there. And it's like, nobody even knows what the right one to use anymore is.
Yeah, I guess I would add to my point of like, don't change things for the sake of changing things. Like, I think like if there's a way of doing things and that way of doing things works, okay, consistency for what you're trying to do, just do it that way. You can make the argument that we should make some bigger changes otherwise. But I also think like you maybe try and make an argument as to why you should shift away from the consistent thing you have now. Once again, I've just seen so many code bases and so many orgs get stuck trying to plan that big revision, and then it just those become just like so much work on their own, and usually engineers wind up advocating for, let's go away for 6 months and fix this. It's very alluring. People love that. It's like catnip to developers. They're like, let's go. 6 months for me to just go work on this one thing. I want to go do that.
I feel like that's a junior developer thing too. Like they see a code base, like, just give me 6 months, I'll fix it all.
Junior developers will be like 2 weeks. It'll take me 2 weeks.
You're probably right there.
So I want to tell you my inspiration for that question. Like, I work in a code base right now where when I started, the database was in a config file, configured globally, and just willy-nilly things would call out to that config package, grab the global database and use it. And we've been transitioning to, like putting the database in a struct that then gets passed down. Would you go through and do that all at once, or would you change it over time and lack that consistency?
Oh, I do that over time. I would not try and do that all at once. That sounds awful.
Over time, yeah.
I think there's also places where you can gradually implement things. Like if you have one package and you're like, or one section of code that you can maybe do that all at once, so that like that small bit of the world is consistent. But then, like there are ways to sort of meet in the middle, I guess, there. But doing an entire code base, especially a large one, would be a nightmare.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Next, rapid fire. Not so rapid fire. How do you deal with a code base where there are no tests?
Add some.
Yeah, just start writing tests.
Start somewhere.
But what test do you start with?
You just start writing. I think if you try and sit down and say which test is the ideal one, or which place is the best one.
I guess I'm more asking like personal, like if you just jumped into code base, personally, what would you start with? Not what's the best, because I don't think that's true.
What am I tasked with adding, changing, fixing? Like whatever it is I'm about to work on, if that area of the code base doesn't have tests, I add some.
Or if I'm like tasked with this code base need tests, like the place that I know the best, right? The place I have the most knowledge or most confidence, I can actually write tests there and then go from there.
Okay. I asked because like in my mind, Not always, but most of the time in a code base, the easiest test for me to write is one that's a much higher level of like, if I, like say it's a web service, if I send this request and get this response back, like I'll add a couple tests like that. And then I can go to smaller pieces afterwards if I need to, but I like having something that sort of encapsulates the entire functionality of it, even if it's not the best test in the world or it's not, it's using a ton of services and everything else. It's like, I know this test will make sure I don't drastically break this thing right now.
Yeah, probably integration tests are a good place to start with a lot of, because that's going to give you like the most bang for your buck overall, as far as like getting an understanding and kind of helping to make sure things don't break. If you don't have any tests, it's like, okay, let's just do the high level, as you said, the high level integration level things, kind of move through, and then kind of get lower level into the unit testy things when it makes sense.
I think that leads nicely into my next question is, what do you do when the code isn't written in a testable way? Like my previous example, a global database, right? That's really hard to test. Do you start with the integration tests and hope for the best, or?
I mean, outside of actually fixing the code base to be more testable, yeah, I think like integration tests, they'll probably be slow, but slow tests are better than no tests-ish.
Especially because you don't want to refactor until you have something to verify your refactor works.
It's almost a chicken and egg situation there.
I've done this before, and it's not a fun project to do because I feel like you write tests that you almost feel like these are throwaway tests in some ways, just because they're not really the tests that I want to be there long term. They're not the ones that I would prefer, but it's what I need to move forward and write better tests.
All right, last one. How do you mitigate risk when you do have to make like a big change in like an unfamiliar code base?
I don't like that this is the last one. You need to ask the next question too.
I will. Okay, second to last one. I'll ask the next one.
So the first way you mitigate is you submit the PR under Johnny's GitHub
username. I think usually making sure that there's a good understanding of what it is you're trying to change. So like documentation, and you've talked to people and you've kind of made sure that across the board we all get like, okay, this is what we're trying to do. And then you've actually thought about what could go wrong and what could break, and you haven't just happy pathed everything. You're like, okay, here are the real big challenges we might have, or here are the opportunity costs we're going to make, and here are the other things. So you can actually sit down and do that risk mitigation. So I think the problem with a lot of risk mitigation is that everybody always wants to be very rose-colored glasses about things. I was like, no, it's going to be great. We're gonna do this, and it's going to make everything wonderful, and there's going to be no problems. So just actually identifying the risk, I would say, is the first big step to being able to mitigate them, and probably the hardest step.
There's some things to learn from the change management discipline here, especially the larger the change, especially change that can impact business operations, the ability to say, if you're not e-commerce site, the ability to make money and process credit card transactions, blah, blah, right? The higher risk these things are, right? The more change management you want around that stuff, right? These could range from things like making sure that, okay, everybody, all the stakeholders understand what the change is, like Kris says, what could go wrong, how these things going wrong might manifest themselves. If they do go wrong, how do we mitigate those particular known knowns? And if there are known unknowns, right, like maybe try and have a plan for those things. And it can be as mundane or as simple as also making sure that when you are rolling out this change, you make sure it's the daytime, right, when everybody is present and accounted for. You're not rolling this thing out in the middle of the night where people are going to get paged and things at 2:00 in the morning, right? Just things like that to make sure you can have sort of an all hands on deck kind of situation, and everybody's fully aware of what the change is that you're trying to do. And the business side of stakeholders also understand that, hey, engineering is about to roll out something that is going to hopefully add value, fix a problem, or create a new way to generate more revenue, whatever the business justification is. But there's some inherent risk in that, right? So that whole change management, so if you've never done it yourself, like trying to identify either a project manager or a program manager or some sort of ally that can sort of be in that bridge, right, between the business and the technology side, right? Like you need something like that, right? And larger companies will have those things, but it's much harder for smaller companies to be able to do those things. But the impact of having some sort of change management process in place, not a ton, right? You just tailor it to your level, your size, where you are at a business, but having some sort of, management to the whole process is generally highly recommended.
One thing I would add is that even before the change goes in, I think a mistake people make is they view a like a PR or anything is something that gets code reviewed once. And I think realistically, there should be, for a big change that has a lot of risk, that review process should be like an ongoing thing where you submit a little bit of code, you review that little bit and be like, here's the direction we're going with this, and get people buying in from, whoever it's going to affect, and do multiple reviews of like the different steps along the way. Even if you have to submit it all as one big PR, but having people review it over and over as you incrementally add stuff can add a lot of value. It's one of the areas that, at least historically, I've never found a good way to do it with GitHub. But there are other tools out there that for PRs will actually only show you the changes between the last time you reviewed and this time. And that makes it a lot easier to like incrementally work on something big, but get everybody's buy-in and make sure you're headed in the right direction and that everything is going smoothly, so that when that big thing does land, it's not a surprise to everybody and somebody doesn't get hit with a PR that's like, oh, it's 800 files were changed and this many lines were changed, and nobody has time to really go through a change that big and look at it in detail. It's just really hard to do.
The bigger such changes, the more like you need to lean on, perhaps if you have an infra, if you're lucky enough to have an infra team, or maybe you do SRE and you have a mixture of development and operations going on, like you need to lean on your infra, especially the higher the risk, if everything a developer can do has been done. But beyond that, you just don't know what else could break, especially if the people, you don't have enough people on the team that with the experience of knowing all the different failure modes. Maybe some people have left the company. Maybe you have a team that's new, whatever the case may be. If you can lean on your infra, and I'm talking like, canary deployments or blue green, or, shifting traffic a little bit at a time to the new nodes and making sure nothing is falling apart. Maybe if you're trying to replace something wholesale, maybe you have a shadow service where you're routing the traffic that goes both to the current one, but also a subset of that goes to the new one, right? To see, and then you compare the results at the end, right? There's all kinds of techniques you can use to ensure that you have a smooth transition and not just put the new thing in and cross your fingers and hope that nothing blows up, right? Hope is not a strategy, as we like to say in the SRE world.
I think also like the best way to risk mitigate a big change is to not do a big change and instead do smaller changes. Like,
right. Yeah. If you can help it,
there are definitely techniques for that, but it is very hard sometimes.
I mean,
sometimes
it'll take a lot more time and it takes a lot more. You have to have the skilled people to do it. But in my experience, that's the best way to make big changes.
Something I'll add there is just actually having a rollback plan. You don't want to deploy something, make database changes, and then have the rollback not be compatible with those database changes. And so you have nowhere to go, right?
Testing rollbacks is something that I think people don't do often enough. They just assume, oh, it works. And then when you need to roll back, it's like, oh, that doesn't work now. And we're in a really tough spot.
Yeah, I think this is also...
Yeah, we're going to be down for a little while. Yeah.
Design your code better so that you can do changes. Like with rollbacks and things, it's like there's ways you can design code bases and design data systems so that rollbacks aren't really like, for instance, if you use like copy on write style things, you can take snapshots and then there's like, well, you don't need to roll back. Like if the thing breaks, you can just go back to the old snapshot and you're good. But like that also requires a lot of skill to be able to design things in that way that people don't usually have. But that's another good strategy, is like from the beginning, design so that you can make changes and can kind of do these things with the ability to either go back or the ability to just kind of roll forward or what have you.
Yeah, I'll definitely say those risks vary too, depending on how that's set up. Because I worked on an application that it did sales for some stuff, and they stored a lot of that stuff locally, but all the sales were also stored in Stripe in a way that they could pull that all out later. So they could literally lose their entire database and rebuild it. I think basically users would have had to recreate accounts, but they could have recovered all their purchases and stuff really easily. So it was like they could be a little bit riskier because it's like at the end of the day, we do have, it would suck, but there's a way to recover everything.
All right. Actual last question here. When do you rewrite?
Never.
That is a fool's errand.
I could give some reasoning behind the never. So in my estimation, when you want to rewrite a code base, you have the feeling that probably somewhere between like 20 and 30% of that code base is not doing well. It's not doing what the business wants. There's issues wrong with it. And you probably don't know or don't have a good understanding of what that 70% that's just kind of working is doing. So when you go to try and rewrite it, you're attempting to rewrite 100% of it to make 20 to 30% of it better. And that requires you to actually rewrite that 70% of it that actually works fine right now. while also continuing to run the old thing that you want to get rid of. So like rewrites are very costly, very difficult to manage, and usually fail. And now you're just running two things instead of one, and you haven't gotten rid of the old problem. So,
not to mention it like puts any new features on the old thing at a standstill.
yeah.
Like, because there's almost no way to rewrite and have new features coming in at the same time.
Yeah, so just don't rewrite. If you feel like you need to rewrite, you probably should go learn more about the code base as a whole, and then do what we were just talking about before of finding ways to make big changes or small changes over time in a risk mitigated way to evolve your code base from where it is now to where you would like it to be.
I kind of wish Matt was here because I swear he said that they actually started rewriting something. So
I mean, if you've got the money, you've got the engineering staff, you've got all the apparatus that goes along with a major rewrite, and you know that at the end you're just gonna flip off the switch on the old and go to the new. That's perhaps there could be some justifications. I mean, I've never been in a room where such a decision has been made, but I hear people do it, and it's a thing that folks do, right? But again, I'm not saying you should never, like, there are ways of doing a rewrite, but not in the way we're talking about it, right? So I've actually refactored entire code bases that basically from the point when I started to where the dust settled, right? The code base was entirely different. There were some remnants of some older stuff, which was stable enough, right? During the refactoring, right? The multiple rounds of refactoring, right? Where I'm incrementally changing the tires, under the semi as it's rolling down the highway kind of thing. But I don't stop the semi on the side of the highway, get into a new semi and then hope I'm going to maintain the same velocity, right? I have to keep basically changing things as I'm going from the moment I start to where I end. Yeah, the code base could be entirely different, right? Every piece of it could have been touched and refactored and improved in some way, right? But that's happening in the same code base, never stopping, work on one, starting on the other, and hoping that I can just swap them.
Yeah,
that just never goes well.
I think it's, yes, rewrite your code base, but don't greenfield it, right? Like actually sit down and rewrite what you've already written in place of what is there, like over time. Like if your thing is to like write anew, that's what we're saying. Don't do that. If you want to literally rewrite what you have, yes, please go do that. That's the path forward. Because then you only need to change the things that are broken or bad or you don't like. You can leave the rest of the stuff that's working right where it is. That'll be great.
I think people struggle with that whenever they want to switch languages or something, or like they want to change technologies for some reason. So like if you want to go from like Ruby to Go for some reason or whatever, it's a lot harder to think, well, how do I do this incrementally versus like if it's a code base where you can change small pieces of it, it's a lot easier to take that refactor approach. I'm not saying you should necessarily rewrite because it is a huge undertaking and there's probably a lot of things that you're going to figure out that you weren't expecting. But
that's why it pays to be a polyglot, right? I mean, that's why we talk about all the time. We espouse the virtue of, right tool for the job all the time, right? So like even in a so-called Ruby shop, right? And I've been around some of those, or Python only shop or Java only shop. Like whenever I hear like we only do this in any sort of engineering team, that's a bit of a cold smell for me, right? Again, I understand the reason why somebody would say, hey, you know what? We only do JavaScript here, front end, back end, client side, all the things, JavaScript, all the things. Now, there are reasons why I will chuckle internally if you did that. But from a business standpoint, it may make sense to say, hey, I'm going to hire just a JavaScript developer, right? And I'm going to toss them on the back end, and I can also toss them on the front end if I need to. I don't know if it's truly that interchangeable, but you can make the business argument for being sort of a mono-linguistic kind of shop, right? And that's fine. But the reality is there are going to be some things that are better suited, right, for different kinds of languages, right? If you could be a Ruby shop, but maybe there's a mission critical part of your operation that requires better performance or multi-threaded programming or whatever the case. Maybe you can use something like Rust or Go or whatever it is under the hood, right? Like you can't say, hey, we only do this. That's just, like painting yourself in a corner for no good reason. Bring it.
I would say that like, I think in most cases, using a different language is not the correct solution to the problem. If you are already using a language, right? If you're starting something brand new, sure, go swap out languages, go build that knowledge. But if you have something that is already working and you already have knowledge, expertise of some level in that thing already, likely switching to a new language is a grass is greener on the other side sort of situation. And it's not going to get you the benefits that you want because languages are so similar to each other and because there is so much performance you can get out of pretty much any modern programming language that it's like, what are the reasons for making this transition and change? And could you instead make like social level changes that get you what you want? Like, is the reason why you want to shift because your code base is just not written that well? Okay, well, write it better in the language you've already written it in, instead of being like, oh, we'll go write it in this new language and it'll be better, right? I think that's what actually leads to like what we've all seen of those atrocious Go code bases, because like someone had Ruby or Python. It's like, this isn't working for XYZ reason. Let's go to Go, even though we don't really understand it. And then they try and write it and they're like, but they're still trying to write Ruby or Python or whatever, Java, what have you, in Go. And then you just wind up with an even messier situation. So I think like, I see your perspective around like, yeah, sure, like maybe it'd be good to be a polyglot shop. I just think it's very challenging to actually be a polyglot shop and to actually use multiple languages. And it requires a level of like high level engineering, like architecture and design that I think a lot of people in the industry like don't have, and a lot of companies aren't willing to actually sit down and do, because you have to actually structure things so that you can actually use all of those languages. Like for everything, for all of your dev tooling you have to be able to use it in 2 different languages. For your staffing, for your planning, you have to be able to plan knowing that perhaps people are strong in one language and not strong in another. And if you need that person to write something because they have the knowledge of how to write something, but it's not in their main language, that you're going to have to devote more resources to it, right? Like all of the calculations about how you do development when you want to incorporate multiple languages is a bit tougher. I mean, it's the same thing of like, if you wanted to run your business in 2 different natural languages, right? If you wanted to have it be a business that runs in both English and Spanish, that's going to be more challenging than if you just wanted to run your business in English or Spanish, right? So I think it's the same thing for programming languages, where it's like, if you want to be able to use multiple programming languages, you're going to have higher cost overall. And those really do need to offset the benefits you get need to offset those costs.
It's a trade-off. It's a trade-off. So if I do have a dual business, maybe I am serving the, Anglo-Hispanic community, and it is an advantage to my business to be able to speak both English and Spanish. So, bringing somebody on the team who knows how to speak Spanish, if I only know how to speak English, is a great business decision. So if you look at the language choices in the same way, to say that, okay, I have a mainly Ruby and Rails, app, and I need to fork out to a Rust process or a Go process or something more performant to do this particular process intensive, right? CPU intensive or memory intensive, whatever the case may be, you can do that one thing. Yeah. So it's complementary, not duplication, right? If that makes sense.
Yeah. But John's original question was, what if you're going from like rewriting a thing in a new language?
Oh, I took that from Johnny to mean like, instead of rewriting the thing, could you take a piece of it out, rewrite that piece that needs rewritten in the new language, and use something like gRPC to communicate, and then you have that like freedom to do that. So like, and I agree with that, but it's kind of that middle ground of, you don't want to just introduce 8 services all in different languages because you can. It's like, well, you should have some restraint, because like you said, there is extra cost. But it's always interesting to me that like on backends, we're always, not always, but a lot of times people are resistant to have different languages. But then the default in everybody's head is use some backend language, and you always use JavaScript up front end. Like nobody's ever like, oh, we're going to start with just you using server rendered HTML or whatever and trying to make that work. Or at least it's not as common to start there for any type of web stuff. And it's weird that they make that distinction of, we don't want Go and Python, but we're fine with Go and JavaScript.
I think that's because there's an organizational boundary. I mean, even though people don't understand there's an organizational boundary between the browser and the backend. So those are in 2 different spaces, but there's not one in a lot of people's heads in the backend. So it's like, oh, you're like co-mingling Python and Go together in this space, where it's like, it'd be like if you use like some WebAssembly and you had like some C and some Rust and some JavaScript all working together in the front end. I think a lot of people would be like, that's also gross.
But I guess I say it's weird to me in the sense that I feel like you still have the problem of intermingling engineers, because most engineers are very good at one or the other. It's kind of rare that you find somebody who's exceptionally good at both front end and back end, just because by default, they just tend to focus on one more than the other.
Alrighty. Some lively discussion today.
I mean, you put Johnny and me on the same episode. What'd you expect to happen?
Let's move on to some unpopular opinions.
I actually think you should probably leave.
So who's got them today? Kris, you always have an unpopular opinion.
I have a spicy unpopular opinion today. Or I guess it depends on the type of person you are, how spicy this is, but I think it's pretty spicy. So my unpopular opinion is that unions in tech is a really bad idea for where tech is right now. Just think like we should not even be contemplating unionizing. Like that's just it's the wrong path forward for us.
So for context, is there what is the context of this? Is there somebody considering unionizing? I don't pay attention enough in the news, I guess.
I mean, it comes up a lot of like, oh, well, if tech was unionized, we wouldn't have problem X, Y, or Z. Like, I think I saw it coming up on the changelog Slack of like, oh, like we wouldn't be getting replaced with AI if we had unions. And so I think like there's kind of like two pieces of why I think unions aren't a great idea for tech. The first is that we have a lot of like mobility and we like our mobility, and unions like usually are structured so there isn't like as much mobility. Like jumping from one job to the next probably won't get you that big of a raise anymore if we have like an industry-wide union, because it's like, oh, this is your level in the union, you're just going from one company to the other, you will make the same amount of money as you did at the other company because it's union and we have a standardized contract, so everything is kind of the same across the board. And if we didn't have industry-wide unions, then it kind of opens the question of like, why should we have a union? Why should we have all these small unions? And that's like, I think like it's not that big of a problem. If that was the only issue, I'd be like, okay, fine, whatever. We get standard salaries. That might be good in some ways. The bigger reason why I don't think we should have unions is because the model that unions have as of today doesn't fit with the structure of tech companies that we have. So if you look at places that are unionized, like whether it's like acting or like retail or what have you, there's usually a large number of people who are individual contributors and then like management, and it's usually very flat. In tech, we have a structure that has a very deep and tall management hierarchy and also a very tall individual contributor hierarchy, which means that if you use the standard union model, you'll wind up with people in the union who are basically in meetings with the CEO all the time and have like the same amount of influence as a high-level SVP, but get to be in the union. But low-level managers who are like the first level line manager wouldn't be allowed in the union, even though they don't have pretty much any influence over what management as a whole does. Because that's the dividing line in union structures of today. It's like, if you're in management, you're not in the union. If you're not in management, you get to be in the union. So in order for unions to work in tech, we would either have to completely change the organizational structure of tech companies to make them flatter, or we would have to come up with an entire new model of who gets to be in the union and who does not get to be in the union. And I think that would be very difficult for how things are now, because you'd have to draw a line somewhere of like, this group of managers and ICs gets to be in the union and this other group of managers and ICs doesn't get to be in the union. And I don't have confidence we'd be able to draw that line very well. Because the thing you don't want in a union is to have people that are in high-level management having lots of influence on what the union does, because then it doesn't make any sense to have the union in the first place, because now it's just going to wind up being controlled and influenced by management anyway, which is what you don't want, right? It's supposed to be like a separate entity that represents like the quote unquote people.
I feel like unions there's got to be different structures, but the unions that I'm like most familiar with, I guess, are like people working in like factories or something along those lines, where there's a bunch of employees. And in a lot of those cases, like a lot of the ways the union works are things like the longer somebody's been there, the more priority they have or seniority they have inside of the union for a variety of things. And like that seems so weird to think about that in the software perspective, where I've seen people like in the railroad industry as an example. I have a friend who literally graduated college, went and worked for a railroad company and has been there since. And to me, that is mind-boggling to be at the same company that long, because in the software world, that's just unheard of. And he's, he's management, so he's not in the union. But I'm thinking like I don't know how that would work for developers. I feel like your way of determining seniority and everything couldn't ever be purely based on like time there.
And the other thing about it too is like it's not just that you're in the same company, because lots of people are like at Google for a long time or at Facebook or any of the FANG companies for a long time. It's that you're in the same role. If you transition to a new role, you lose some of that seniority. At least I think you lose some of that seniority. So it's like,
yeah, I think
you're
right.
in the same role, and that's what you do. And that's the thing you do. And there's this box of like your responsibilities, and that's kind of what your career is, which is also just not the way that we do things in tech. So, and I'm not saying we shouldn't do some sort of collective bargaining sort of thing if people really want to do it, but like saying we should just unionize, it's a much harder problem than that. And that effort would probably be better spent just making our companies not crappy. Because I think that's part of the problem is like our companies are poorly run, and we really just want companies that are better run. And I think we should focus on that aspect.
I think the hardest thing here is that we've all, at least from what I can tell, I feel like we've been somewhat spoiled to work for decent companies. And then I look at like game developers who are working in much worse conditions, and I could see them having a very different opinion.
I mean, I would not say, my career experience as a Black queer person in tech, I would not say that the companies I've worked for are necessarily
okay.
There have been many an issue that, once again, like,
okay, so I apologize for making a bad assumption, but I guess I was just saying that I've seen some parts of the industry that, like, I've had people ask me why I didn't go into the games, because people have been like, oh, you like playing games, why don't you go into that side? And I'm like, that side of the industry is absolutely horrible to work in. Like, I don't see why anybody goes there. And like the story that I can usually easily tell people is that whenever I was in college, there was one point where Google and Facebook were offering internships that I think paid like $7,000 a month and provided housing for 3 months. And then at the time, Battle.net was really big, so Blizzard was really big, and they were offering an internship that was unpaid. You had to pay, I think you had to pay for your own housing too for 3 months. And they were both getting people. And I'm like, I don't understand how Blizzard is getting interns when you could be making $7,000 or $8,000 a month as a college student working at these other companies and having just as good of a name on your resume.
I've got it on pop.
Jenna's like, we're done talking about
Let's
this.
hear
it. Enough about unions. I've got an unpop. All right, here it is. To change the meaning of words, you need one of two things. Be popular enough or have enough money. Case in point, popularity on the popularity side. I just learned of the term Riz, which is, you know, a slang term,
boomer.
right? It's a slang term generally meaning, you know, style, charm, attractiveness, right? That's now, you know, like a word definition. That's now something people can use. That's popularity. So Riz is now a new thing. I can say your boy has got some Riz, right? And you know what I mean?
Do you know what Riz is short for?
No idea.
Charisma. But go ahead.
Oh, okay. Hey, I just learned something new today.
Me too.
Okay. Yeah, boomer, Ian. So the other thing out in industry, as we are recording this, I think we are literally redefining what the term open means. So if you ever heard of the company named OpenAI, you do know, hopefully, that it has nothing to do with the openness of the code bases, the models, the data, the practices, and everything that goes into those large language models. The open in there doesn't really mean any of that. It simply means for the benefit of other people, right? So, OpenAI, it's, if we achieve AGI, they will make it available, right, for the benefit of humanity. But that doesn't mean anything with regards to the actual anything that went into making AGI. So the term open is quite literally being redefined as we are having this podcast.
I mean, that's how. That's just how words work.
No, Chris.
I guess yes.
That's not how words work. Words used to mean things, damn it. I'm like shaking my head at the cloud.
I mean, words are, I like, and to make something change in popular culture, yes, you are right. Like, either you need to be popular enough or you need to have money, and then you just can bulldoze through things. But also, I think there's a lot of like subtle things, like literally, for example, means both literally and the exact opposite of literally figuratively, which is confusing. Or like Johnny, right. early in the podcast, you used the word judiciously when you meant liberally, because judiciously is the opposite of what you meant. So it's like there are words, like words just kind of move and shift and change, and it's all about like what do we understand, and that's where I think they shift. But yes, I do agree that like if you're a big enough person, you can just make things happen. Or if you just happen to get a good meme, like if you can make a real good meme, then you can change language however you please.
Apple just renamed VR to spatial computing, right? Like,
well, they renamed AR/VR to spatial computing.
I mean, in Johnny's defense, Apple does have a lot of money.
A lot of money.
Apple's they have maybe the most money. Like they have,
like not only that, but they've like haven't they basically said you have to refer to like the VR headset as like whatever the heck the name is that they require you to use.
Wait, the Apple Vision Pro?
Almost definitely that's true.
It's like the Apple Vision, like whatever the heck the name is, you like have to use that. You aren't allowed to say like Apple VR or anything in like news press or anything. Like any of the people who are using it are supposed to use it in a very specific way.
This is not the first time Apple has done this. I mean, you take any standard technology, they put their own name on it. They're like literally there's like entire websites dedicated to how Apple takes, like USB-C and renames it to something else, right? Just so they can have their own names on things, their own branding on things.
Yeah, they like their own brand. I mean, but this is once again, this is how it works. Like Johnny, I don't know if you know, but Riz as a word has a really long history within the Black community. So it's one of those words that has made the transition from Black culture and AAVE into white culture, where it has now blown up, or like I guess outside of Black culture, not just white culture. It's like other people's culture using it too.
Are you calling me white?
I'm not calling you white. I'm calling you a boomer still. Like I don't. I mean,
I think we should end the show right now, Ian. We've crossed over.
I feel like the unpopular opinion should be Johnny is a boomer. Just to see if everybody agrees or disagrees.
Oh man, that'd be brutal. Yeah, that'd be brutal.
All right, John, do you have an unpopular opinion?
I do not.
All right, neither do I. So we will call it there.
Y'all just running.
For fear of being called a boomer myself, I will just call it quits.
All right.
Oh man.
All right, that is go time for this week. Thanks for listening. Thanks once again to our friends at Fly.io, to Breakmaster Cylinder for beat freaking for us, and to Sentry.io. Save $100 off their team plan by using code CHANGELOG when you sign up. That's all for now, but we'll talk to you again next time on Go Time. Mm.